March 10th, 241 BC. Rome was bankrupt. The treasury empty. 23 years of war had drained every last coin. According to the ancient historian Polybius, the Senate couldn't afford a single warship. So wealthy Romans did something unprecedented in ancient warfare. They loaned their personal fortunes to build a fleet. 200 warships funded by private citizens, repayable only if Rome won the war. It was the ancient world's most audacious financial gamble. And on this morning, in the waters between 3 small islands off Sicily, that gamble would either save the Roman Republic or destroy Rome's richest families. Think about those numbers. 200 Roman ships faced 250 Carthaginian warships, plus up to 350 transport vessels, over 600 ships total. But the Carthaginians carried a fatal burden, documented by underwater archaeology: tons of food, wine, oil, and weapons meant to supply their starving army in Sicily. 27 bronze rams, 35 helmets, hundreds of amphorae recovered from the seabed confirm what Polybius recorded. This cargo turned Carthage's numerical advantage into a death sentence. By the end of this story, you'll understand how documented Roman innovation, Carthaginian strategic negligence, and one morning's brutal ramming warfare ended the longest war in ancient history. I'm about to reveal 3 verified facts that changed Mediterranean history. First, how Rome's private citizens became venture capitalists who literally bought victory, a financing model never attempted before in ancient warfare. Second, the winter training program that transformed novice rowers into the most elite naval force Rome ever fielded, daily drilling for 4 to 6 months straight. Third, why Carthaginian ships carrying relief supplies for 20,000 starving soldiers couldn't maneuver when Romans appeared, where weather made them impossible to intercept. But here's what makes this battle historically extraordinary. How did Roman crews row at combat speed directly into gale force winds, an achievement Carthaginian commanders thought physically impossible? What tactical decision, documented by multiple sources and confirmed by underwater archaeology, gave Rome the split-second advantage that decided 23 years of war in 4 hours? Why did the Carthaginians, masters of the Mediterranean for centuries, sail cargo-laden warships into battle? And how did this single naval engagement create such Carthaginian humiliation that 20 years later, Hamilcar Barca's son Hannibal would invade Italy, seeking revenge? To understand how private loans and bronze rams ended Rome's existential crisis, we need to step back to 242 BC, when the First Punic War had bankrupted both superpowers, and neither could afford to continue. But neither dared to surrender. 23 years, longer than World War I and World War II combined. The First Punic War, which began in 264 BC, had become a generational meat grinder that consumed both the Roman Republic and the Carthaginian Empire in a struggle for Sicily and Mediterranean supremacy. Polybius, writing barely a century after the events, with access to sources we've lost official records, veteran accounts, documents, painted a picture of catastrophic attrition unprecedented in ancient warfare. This wasn't just the longest continuous war in ancient history. It was an economic and demographic apocalypse. The war's scale defied comprehension. By ancient standards, Rome and Carthage threw everything into Sicily. Fleets that darkened the horizon. armies that stripped cities of their fighting men. Treasuries emptied year after year with no end visible. But the Mediterranean itself proved deadlier than any enemy. Between 255 and 253 BC, Rome lost approximately 700 quinqueremes during the war, not to Carthaginian rams or fire ships, but to storms. According to Polybius's detailed accounts, around 100,000 Romans drowned in successive disasters off Camarina and Palinurus. 284 ships lost in one storm. 150 inches, another. The sea swallowed entire fleets while survivors on shore could only watch the horizon fill with wreckage. These weren't just military disasters. They were demographic catastrophes. Roman census records, documented in historical sources, show a 17% decline in adult male citizens during the war. The vital reservoir from which the Republic drew its legionaries and naval crews. 17%. Think about that proportion. Nearly 1 in 5 adult men dead, crippled, or missing. The psychological trauma ran deeper than the casualty lists. Rome had built fleets from scratch after watching its first attempts drown, then watched those replacement fleets drown too. After the disasters of the 250s, the Senate temporarily abandoned naval warfare altogether. The maritime power that had challenged Carthage's centuries of nautical dominance simply gave up and let the conflict stall into a static land war. Carthage faced a parallel crisis of will and finance. Though from a different direction, the Carthaginian Senate, composed of wealthy merchant princes, had the naval expertise Rome lacked. But maintaining a fleet of 250 quinqueremes and a vast mercenary army year after year proved unsustainable even for the Mediterranean's premier trading empire. Historical sources document that Carthaginian leadership, increasingly influenced by the landed aristocracy under Hanno the Great, began prioritizing expansion into the North African hinterland over the costly and stagnant defense of Sicily. They made a fatal strategic assumption, believing the Roman naval threat had been neutralized by the storms of the 250s. Carthage took the catastrophic step of decommissioning much of its navy. Warships went into reserve. Experienced crews dispersed. The maritime infrastructure that had made Carthage master of the Western Mediterranean for 3 centuries simply atrophied through neglect. By 243 BC, both empires had reached the same exhausted conclusion: the Roman treasury was empty. The Carthaginian treasury was empty. Neither could field another major fleet. Neither could sustain another year of full-scale warfare. The First Punic War had reached an economic stalemate where continuation seemed impossible. But surrender remained unthinkable. Sicily's ports and grain fields had cost both sides everything they had, and neither had anything left to spend. But in 242 BC, with both empires bankrupt and broken, a handful of Rome's wealthiest citizens proposed a radical solution that had never been attempted in ancient warfare. They would gamble their personal fortunes on one final throw of the dice, and that gamble would change the course of Western civilization. The Roman Senate's solution to bankruptcy seemed absurd at first hearing. Ask the people who still had money to fund a war the government couldn't afford. But these weren't donations or patriotic contributions. According to Polybius's detailed account of the financing scheme, these were investments, high risk, potentially catastrophic investments where the entire principle would be lost if Rome failed to win the war. Wealthy patricians and equestrians, Rome's elite, would fund the construction of warships personally. The loans would be repayable only from the indemnities extracted from a defeated Carthage. Win the war, get repaid with interest. Lose the war, lose everything. The genius of this arrangement, documented in historical sources, lay in how it aligned every possible incentive. The investors were the same men who sat in the Senate making strategic decisions about the war. Political and financial objectives became identical. There could be no negotiated peace that left Carthage intact enough to avoid paying. There could be no premature settlement. The fleet wasn't just a military asset, it was a financial instrument of the Roman elite, ensuring that the Republic would pursue nothing less than total victory to guarantee the return on investment. Private capital had created a mechanism where Rome's richest families couldn't afford to lose. The result, approximately 200 high-quality quinqueremes built and equipped without immediate government expense. Command of this privately financed fleet went to the consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus, supported by the praetor Quintus Valerius Falto. Catulus was what Romans called a novus homo, a new man, the first in his family to reach the consulship. His elevation represented the Republic's meritocratic ideal in action. He had no distinguished ancestors, no inherited military glory, just competence, political skill, and the extraordinary challenge of commanding a fleet that represented the personal fortunes of Rome's most powerful families. Failure meant more than military defeat. It meant financial ruin for the men who'd made the gamble possible. But Catulus and Falto recognized something crucial. Documented in Polybius's analysis of their preparations, building 200 warships meant nothing if they were the same clumsy, top-heavy vessels that had drowned in earlier Roman disasters. Every ship in the 242 BC program was modeled after an exceptionally fast blockade runner captured from Hannibal the Rhodian during the ongoing siege of Lilybaeum. This Rhodian design represented the pinnacle of Mediterranean naval engineering, a combination of speed, stability, and maneuverability that the previous Roman fleets had desperately lacked. The technological evolution was remarkable. In 260 BC, Rome had been so inexperienced at shipbuilding that they'd used a shipwrecked Carthaginian vessel as a literal blueprint, producing hulls that were significantly heavier and less maneuverable than their Punic counterparts. To compensate for nautical inferiority, Romans had introduced the corvus, a heavy boarding bridge with a metal spike that could be dropped onto an enemy deck, effectively turning sea battles into land combat. The corvus had secured early victories at Mylae and Ecnomus, but it proved disastrous in rough weather. The added weight in the bow made ships top-heavy and unstable, which historical analysis suggests contributed massively to the storm losses of the 250 SS. By 242 BC, the corvus had been completely abandoned. Roman crews, hardened by 2 decades of harsh experience, had acquired enough skill to fight traditionally, relying on the ram rather than the boarding bridge. The Rhodian blueprint allowed Roman shipwrights to move beyond crude imitation. These new vessels were optimized for speed and tactical agility, lighter, faster, more responsive than anything Rome had fielded before. It was technology transfer at its most effective. Romans had captured superior enemy design and mass-produced it with systematic efficiency. The private financing model created something unprecedented in ancient military history. It was venture capital applied to warfare. Rome's elite had become investors in victory, with every possible incentive to ensure their investment paid off. The 200 warships they funded represented not just military hardware, but the crystallization of political will, financial desperation, and strategic innovation. Summer 242 BC saw this fleet commissioned, equipped, and prepared for deployment to Sicily. But building 200 perfect warships meant nothing without crews who could sail them. Catullus and Falto had all winter to transform recruits into something Rome had never fielded before, an elite naval force that could challenge Carthage on equal terms. Winter 242 to 241 BC, while most ancient navies sheltered in harbor waiting for spring sailing season. Catullus drilled his crews every single day. Polybius emphasizes this systematic training regimen as crucial to what followed, not a detail mentioned in passing, but a deliberate strategic choice that transformed the campaign's possibilities. Daily drilling throughout the winter months, rowing coordination and formation, ramming maneuvers practiced until they became instinctive. The goal wasn't just competence, it was excellence. Transform recruits who'd never seen naval combat into the most skilled and coordinated fleet Rome had ever fielded. The winter training program represented patient strategic thinking at its best. Catullus and Falto understood something fundamental that earlier Roman commanders had missed. Superior ship design mattered, but crew quality decided battles. 200 Rhodian model vessels, crewed by inexperienced oarsmen, would accomplish nothing. But 200 Rhodian model vessels crewed by men who'd spent months perfecting coordination that could challenge even Carthaginian maritime expertise. Historical sources document that both commanders personally oversaw the training, recognizing that crew excellence would determine whether their unprecedented private financing scheme succeeded or failed spectacularly. They had several months autumn through late winter to build muscle memory, tactical understanding, and unit cohesion. Every day the crews rowed, formations tightened, ramming approaches improved, the kind of grinding, repetitive preparation that never makes it into heroic narratives but determines actual combat outcomes. Summer 242 BC had brought immediate strategic success even before the training program intensified. The fleet arrived in Sicily and promptly captured the harbor of Drepana, one of Carthage's key strongholds on the western coast. Secondary objectives followed, seizing anchorages around Lilybaeum, controlling the approaches to Carthaginian positions. The effect was immediate and decisive. Every seaborne supply line to Carthaginian forces in Sicily was severed. Hamilcar Barca's army on Mount Eryx, which had maintained resistance through 6 years of brilliant guerrilla warfare, was now completely isolated. No food, no reinforcements, no relief possible without a fleet that could break the Roman blockade. While Romans drilled daily through winter, Carthage faced the consequence of its strategic negligence. Late 242, early 241 BC. The timeline is imprecise in sources, but the urgency was extreme. The Carthaginian government finally authorized a relief fleet. Approximately 250 warships were pulled from reserve and recommissioned. The problem was immediate and insurmountable: crews. Carthage had decommissioned its navy years earlier. Experienced sailors had dispersed. New crews had to be hurriedly levied and recruited. Training time, minimal, weeks at most, possibly less. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Roman crews with 4 to 6 months of intensive daily drilling versus Carthaginian crews with bare-bones preparation. Polybius doesn't explicitly quantify the training disparity, but the tactical outcomes make it unmistakable. The quality gap between the two fleets' crews was enormous. Most Carthaginian sailors had no combat experience at all, since the Navy had been effectively dormant during the years when it should have been maintaining readiness. Rome had done to Carthage what Carthage had done to early Rome 20 years earlier, achieved superior crew quality through systematic preparation. The irony was perfect. Rome, the traditional land power with no naval heritage, now had better trained sailors than Carthage, the maritime empire that had dominated Mediterranean trade routes for centuries. By early March 241 BC, Catullus had achieved something extraordinary, documented by the battle's outcome: a Roman fleet that could row in perfect coordination, crews that could maintain tactical formation despite adverse conditions, oarsmen whose muscle memory and timing had been refined through months of relentless practice. This wasn't the Roman navy of the 250s that had drowned in storms and panicked in battles. This was something new, something dangerous, something Carthage wasn't prepared to face. The investment in training was about to face its ultimate test, because Carthage's desperate relief mission was finally ready to sail, and the collision between winter preparation and hurried improvisation would decide whether Rome's unprecedented financial gamble would pay off or whether the private investors would lose everything they'd risked. Mount Eryx, Western Sicily, March 241 BC for 3 years. One man had kept Carthage's war alive through sheer tactical brilliance. Hamilcar Barca, the Lightning, commanded 20,000 mercenaries from a mountain fortress, conducting a guerrilla campaign that made Roman sieges costly and slow. But genius couldn't conjure food from stone, and by March, the arithmetic of starvation had become inescapable. Hamilcar's epithet came from the Punic word Barak lightning or thunderbolt. The name fit. He'd arrived in Sicily in 247 BC to take command of demoralized Carthaginian forces when the war had stalemated and Carthage was losing hope. His initial strategy was audacious: establish a base at Mount Eryx near Palermo and launch naval raids directly against the Italian coast. For 3 years, 247 to 244 BC, Hamilcar pioneered what modern analysts would call asymmetric warfare. His mercenary bands struck Roman supply lines, raided coastal towns, made Roman commanders fear leaving their fortifications. He couldn't match Roman strength directly, so he made the occupation of Sicily expensive, dangerous, and psychologically exhausting. In 244 BC, Hamilcar moved his operation to Mount Eryx in western Sicily. Historical sources describe his position there as a masterpiece of tactical positioning. The mountain itself rises dramatically from the coastal plain, offering commanding views and defensive advantages. Romans held the Temple of Venus on the summit. Romans besieged the port of Drepana below, and Hamilcar occupied the city of Eryx and part of the mountain between them, literally besieging the besiegers. For 3 years, 244 to 241 BC, he maintained this impossible wedge, harassing both Roman positions, conducting constant skirmishing, keeping his 20,000 man army intact and combat effective. The mercenary composition reflected Carthage's empire Greeks, Spanish, Gauls, Balearic Islanders, Libyans, a multinational force bound by pay and Hamilcar's leadership rather than patriotic loyalty. Keeping such men motivated required constant action, visible success, and crucially, regular supplies. Polybius's account makes clear that Hamilcar's tactical brilliance kept his men fighting, but they needed to eat. Every grain shipment, every amphora of wine, every weapon and piece of equipment came by sea from Carthage. The supply line was his lifeline. And in 242 BC, when Catullus's fleet seized Drepana harbor and the Lilybaeum anchorages, that lifeline was severed. The strategic trap was perfectly executed. Hamilcar's position remained militarily strong. His mercenaries could still fight. His mountain fortress remained impregnable to direct assault. But without supplies, time worked against him with mathematical certainty. By early 241 BC, his army was facing starvation. Sources don't document the specific hardships, but military logic makes them obvious. Rations cut, horses slaughtered for meat, the kind of slow-motion collapse that precedes surrender. Geographic analysis shows that from Mount Eryx's summit, which rises approximately 750 meters above sea level, visibility on clear days extends 40-plus kilometers across the Mediterranean. Whether Hamilcar personally observed the fleet's approach on March 10th, sources don't record, but the strategic situation would have been clear from any reports of fleet movements visible from the heights. A relief fleet approaching from the west would have been detectable, its sails marking progress toward salvation or doom. And by afternoon, when those sails either disappeared westward or stopped moving entirely, the implications would have been inescapable. 3 years of brilliant guerrilla warfare, 6 years of keeping Carthaginian resistance alive against overwhelming Roman advantages, all about to be decided by a naval battle Hamilcar couldn't influence or control. His fate depended on ships he couldn't see in detail, commanders he couldn't advise, tactical decisions being made 40 kilometers away in waters he'd never reach. For a general of Hamilcar's capability, it must have been the worst kind of helplessness, strategic impotence despite tactical superiority. Hamilcar had defeated Rome on land for 6 years. But on March 10th, 241 BC, his fate and Carthage's would be decided at sea by ships he couldn't control, whether he stood on the summit watching or received reports hours later. The implications would be inescapable, and the fleet sailing to save him carried the seeds of its own destruction. Early 241 BC, Carthage assembled the largest relief mission in ancient naval history. 250 warships, between 150 to 350 transport vessels. Sources vary on the exact count, but even the lower estimate represents enormous scale. Hundreds of tons of grain, wine, oil, and salted fish packed into amphorae, military equipment for Hamilcar's army. Everything needed to sustain the garrisons at Lilybaeum, Drepana, and Met. Eryx. It should have been unstoppable. According to Polybius's analysis of what followed, it was doomed before it left harbor. The fundamental flaw was strategic, attempting to accomplish 2 contradictory objectives simultaneously. The fleet had to deliver supplies and defeat the Roman navy, but cargo ships need to be heavy for transport, while combat vessels need to be light for maneuverability. Standard naval doctrine, documented across Mediterranean warfare, held that you lighten ships before battle, jettison excess weight, streamline for speed, maximize tactical responsiveness. Carthage violated this basic principle by sailing warships laden with cargo directly into a combat zone where Roman interception was possible. The cargo burden was substantial and archaeologically documented when the Aegates Islands project surveyed the battle site starting in 2005. They found hundreds of amphorae scattered across the seabed. Chemical analysis identified the type's Greek italic wine jars of the MGS 56 variety, Punic oil containers including Maltese ovoid types. The contents originally included wine, olive oil, grain, salted fish, and military equipment. Some jars bore Punic graffiti, evidence of a complex war economy using whatever containers were available, regardless of cultural origin. The physical evidence confirms Polybius's description of a supply mission, and, more than that, confirms the cargo was still aboard when battle commenced. Command of this massive fleet went to an admiral named Hanno. That's essentially all Polybius tells us about him. Hanno was an extremely common Carthaginian name, like calling someone John or Muhammad. We don't know his background, his previous commands, or his qualifications. He wasn't Hanno the Great, the political leader of the anti-Barcid faction. He was just Hanno, admiral of what would become a catastrophe. His obscurity in sources suggests either that he wasn't particularly distinguished beforehand, or that Carthaginian historians preferred to forget him afterward. The crew quality crisis compounded the strategic error. Historical sources make clear the Carthaginian ships were manned by hurriedly levied crews with minimal training. Most sailors were inexperienced, having been recruited after the Navy's long decommissioning. Worse, the warships were undercomplemented with Marines, the infantry who would defend decks during boarding actions. The plan, according to Polybius's account, was to sail to Sicily, land the supplies, lighten the ships, and then embark Hamilcar's veteran troops to serve as Marines for the subsequent battle with the Roman fleet. It was a sequential strategy, supply delivery first, naval combat second. The problem with sequential strategies is they assume you control the timeline. Hanno's plan required reaching the Sicilian coast, finding safe landing zones, unloading tons of cargo, and embarking thousands of soldiers, all before Romans could interfere. That assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. But in early March, when the fleet sailed from Carthage, confidence apparently ran high. The strategy was to reach the island of Hiera, modern Marettimo, the westernmost of the Aegates Islands, and wait there for favorable winds. When strong westerlies developed, the plan called for a high-speed dash to the Sicily coast under full sail. Speed and weather would substitute for tactical preparation. Hanno's subsequent actions suggest he believed Romans couldn't intercept in heavy weather. The fleet's formation when it sailed from Hiera, standard approach with cargo still aboard, no preliminary lightning operations, indicates confidence in reaching the coast before engagement became necessary. Whether this was Hanno's personal assessment or the result of intelligence reports suggesting Roman unreadiness, sources don't specify. What's documented is the decision itself: sail with cargo, accept the mobility penalty, gamble that weather and speed would prevent Roman interception. By early March, Hanno's fleet was anchored at Hera, cargo holds full, waiting for the wind that would carry them to Sicily. The supplies that should have saved Hamilcar's army were about to become the weight that drowned Carthage's navy. Sometimes the seeds of catastrophic defeat are sown in the strategic assumptions that seem most reasonable at the time. The Aegates Islands, 3 pieces of rock jutting from the Mediterranean west of Sicily, Favignana, Levanzo, Marettimo. Between them, narrow straits where currents run fast and winds funnel unpredictably. Perfect sailing territory if you know the waters, a death trap if you don't. Archaeological surveys conducted over the past 2 decades have mapped this underwater battlefield with precision that ancient commanders could never have imagined. The seabed tells a story of geography weaponized. The islands form a rough triangle, approximately 30 kilometers from the Sicilian coast. Favignana, ancient Aegusa, is the largest, a low-lying landmass offering some shelter but limited strategic advantage. Levanzo, ancient Forbantia, is smaller, rockier, its cliffs rising more dramatically from the water. Marettimo, ancient Hera, sits furthest west, the first landmark for ships approaching Sicily from Carthage. Between them, the straits channel wind and water into predictable but treacherous patterns. Ships approaching Sicily from the west have limited route options. You go through the islands or you go around them, adding distance and time. For a fleet trying to reach the coast quickly, the direct route between Levanzo and Favignana was the obvious choice. The water depth in the battle area ranges from 70 to 130 meters. Modern archaeological expeditions, using ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, have recovered artifacts from these depths. And the cold, dark water has preserved them remarkably. But in 241 BC, that depth meant something else. It meant drowning. A man in armor who goes into waters 70 meters deep doesn't have the option of wading to shore or clinging to wreckage in shallow water. He sinks, and he doesn't come back up. The Mediterranean floor in this area becomes a tomb. March 9 to 10, 241 BC. Polybius's account documents the weather conditions explicitly. Strong westerly wind blowing from west towards Sicily. For Carthaginians sailing east, this was perfect. Wind behind them, full sails driving ships forward at maximum speed. For Romans who needed to intercept by rowing, it was theoretically crippling. Rowing into wind and heavy seas requires exponentially more effort than rowing with calm water. The physics favor sailing over rowing by approximately 3:1 in terms of speed. Hanno's calculation, based on his actions, appears to have been straightforward. Romans couldn't row fast enough into westerly gales to intercept a sailing fleet. The weather itself would prevent interception. March 9th, Roman scouts spotted the Carthaginian fleet at anchor off Marettimo. The observation system isn't detailed in sources, but military logic makes it obvious. You don't maintain a naval blockade of Sicily without watching the western approaches. Lookout posts on Levanzo or Favignana would have clear sightlines to Marettimo. A fleet of 600 ships anchoring at Hera couldn't be missed. The intelligence reached Catullus, who faced an immediate decision. He was injured. Polybius mentions this explicitly, though the nature of the injury isn't specified and couldn't personally command in battle. But he could authorize his praetor, Quintus Valerius Valto, to intercept at all costs. The critical Roman preparation, documented by Polybius and confirmed by archaeological absence, was stripping the ships completely. Masts and sails were left on shore at Levanzo, all excess equipment removed. Some archaeological speculation suggests Romans may have even cut their heavy lead anchors to reduce weight further, though this remains unverified. The purpose was singular: maximize rowing speed. Every ounce of weight removed translated into fractionally faster movement. And those fractions, accumulated across 200 ships, might mean the difference between intercepting Hanno's fleet and watching it sail past. The tactical gamble was explicit. By leaving masts and sails on shore, Romans sacrificed any ability to pursue fleeing enemies under sail. If Carthaginians broke through and fled with wind behind them, Romans couldn't follow. They traded pursuit capability for interception capability, a calculated risk that made sense only if they could achieve their objective of blocking Hanno's approach before he reached the Sicilian coast. It was an all-or-nothing commitment. Romans positioned themselves between Levanzo and Favignana, forming a battle line that blocked the direct route to Sicily. Polybius confirms this positioning, and the archaeological distribution of artifacts, rams, helmets, amphorae validates it. The seabed between these two islands shows the highest concentration of battle debris. Romans had turned geography into a weapon to reach Sicily. Carthaginians would have to go through them. March 10th, dawn. The wind blew strong from the west. Hanno ordered his fleet to sail, apparently confident that Romans couldn't intercept in such conditions. He was about to discover what 4 months of winter training could achieve against every reasonable expectation of physics and seamanship. March 10th. 247 BC. Dawn. The westerly wind howled across Marettimo harbor, perfect for sailing. Hanno gave the order 250 warships, hundreds of transports, over 600 ships total, unfurled their sails and turned east toward Sicily. The sea spray was cold enough to sting exposed skin. The rigging sang in the gale. Every sail bellied full. It should have been a triumphant dash to salvation. Then they saw the line. Hanno's subsequent actions suggest he expected clear passage to Sicily. The fleet's formation, sailing in standard approach without preliminary cargo lightening, indicates confidence in reaching the coast before engagement. His decision to sail with cargo still aboard suggests he believed Romans couldn't intercept in such weather. The expected journey time was only a few hours under full sail to reach the landing zones where supplies could be offloaded and Hamilcar's troops embarked. Everything about the Carthaginian approach indicates they thought they controlled the timeline. The Romans proved them catastrophically wrong. Positioned between Levanzo and Favignana, approximately 200 ships formed a single coordinated battle line, blocking the route to Sicily. Polybius's explicit word choice is significant here. The Carthaginians were astounded. This documented reaction suggests the interception was completely unexpected. The Romans had achieved what Carthaginian commanders apparently thought impossible, rowing at combat speed directly into gale force wind. The physics of what Romans accomplished deserves emphasis. Rowing into heavy wind and seas doesn't just require more effort, it requires exponentially more effort as wind speed increases. Maintaining formation while doing so requires extraordinary coordination. Every ship must row at matching speed, despite varying wave impacts. Every oar crew must maintain rhythm despite exhaustion. The achievement becomes comprehensible only in light of Catullus and Falto's winter training program. 4 to 6 months of daily drilling had created muscle memory and unit cohesion that allowed Roman crews to accomplish what Carthaginian assumptions deemed impossible. The psychological impact was immediate and decisive. Polybius emphasizes the Carthaginian surprise, and the tactical consequences that followed validate his account. Hanno's fleet had committed to forward movement under sail. Reversing course into the wind would be difficult and time-consuming. Attempting to break through the Roman line while ships remained cargo-laden would be suicide. The maneuverability penalty was too severe. The logical option would be immediate cargo jettisoning to restore combat capability. But there wasn't time. Romans were already closing. Archaeological evidence from the amphorae scatter patterns suggests some Carthaginian ships did attempt to jettison cargo during the engagement. Hundreds of wine and oil jars found scattered across the battle area, rather than concentrated in cargo hold patterns, indicate deliberate dumping. But this was desperate improvisation during combat, not systematic preparation before it. Ships attempting to lighten loads while simultaneously defending against Roman rams and boarding parties were trying to execute two incompatible tasks under extreme pressure. The Roman advantages compounded beyond just positioning and crew training. Their ships were light, stripped of every unnecessary ounce. Carthaginian ships were heavy, laden with tons of supplies. Roman crews were experienced, months of intensive preparation. Carthaginian crews were novices, weeks of hurried training at most. Roman ships could maneuver, the Rhodian design, performing exactly as intended. Carthaginian ships wallowed, top-heavy with cargo, sluggish in response to rudder and oars. Before the first ram struck home, the tactical situation had already been decided. Carthaginian ships were heavy, slow, their crews inexperienced. Roman ships were light, fast, their crews the product of 4 months' relentless drilling, and between them 70 to 130 meters of cold Mediterranean water, deep enough to swallow fleets whole. Polybius would record what happened next. The seabed would preserve it for 265 years. At the prow of every Roman warship, 270 kilograms of bronze. 3 blades, each 60 centimeters wide, cast in the lost wax method and fitted to the ship's timber skeleton with bronze spikes. The rostrum, the ram, not a weapon for sinking ships quickly, but for smashing through hulls below the waterline, letting the Mediterranean flood into rowing decks. 22 centuries later, archaeologists would pull 27 of these bronze teeth from the seabed. Their damage patterns tell the story ancient sources could only describe. The Aegates Islands Archaeological Project, which began systematic surveys in 2008, has recovered these rams using ROVs and specialized technical divers. Each ram weighs approximately 270 kilograms, too heavy for casual handling. Substantial enough that installing one on a ship's prow required careful engineering and secure bronze spike attachment to the wooden structure beneath. The manufacturing technique was lost wax casting. A wax model is coated in clay, the wax melted out, and molten bronze poured into the resulting mold. The result, custom-fitted bronze weaponry. Each ram, unique to its specific ship, 7 of the recovered rams bear Latin inscriptions that illuminate Roman administrative culture. The standard formula reads, Qu Quaestor approbavit, the quaestor approved. This is the probatio system in action, official certification by a financial magistrate that the ram had been properly constructed and the bronze expenditure justified. Every ram required bureaucratic approval before installation. Even weapons manufacturing went through legal contracting procedures. Marcus Publicius Malleolus appears on multiple rams, including those catalogued as Aegates 4, Lo, and 11. Historical records show he later became aedile in 241 BC and consul in 232 BC, making these inscriptions biographical evidence as well as military artifacts. Another name appears on different rams: Lucius Quintius, documented on Aegates 7, Ba, and 10. The pattern suggests different quaestors certified different batches of rams during the multi-year naval building programs of the First Punic War. These weren't just weapons, they were legal documents cast in bronze, proof that Roman bureaucratic precision extended even into the chaos of warfare. One ram, Aegates 3, bears something completely different, a Punic inscription, a prayer to Baal or Tanit, asking the ram to pierce enemy ships and for the gods to build a surge under the hull. The cultural contrast is striking: Roman legalism versus Carthaginian religiosity, both preserved in bronze. Forensic analysis of the rams reveals the violence of the collisions. Archaeological reports describe the damage as vicious, V-shaped scratches across bronze surfaces, bent fins from impact force, deformation patterns consistent with head-on ramming and lateral strikes. The rams didn't just punch holes, they tore through wooden hulls with devastating effect. 2 primary sectors, designated PWA and PWB in archaeological surveys, show the highest concentration of rams and other artifacts. These are the collision zones, where ships crash together in sustained combat. The Roman tactical approach was traditional Mediterranean ramming warfare, unlike the earlier Corvus period, when Rome had tried to turn naval battles into infantry combat. By 241 BC, Roman crews relied on the ram as their primary weapon. The technique: accelerate to ramming speed. Aim for the enemy hull at or below the waterline. Strike with maximum force. Withdraw before your ram becomes lodged in the sinking ship. Months of training had perfected the timing and coordination required. A successful ramming attack wasn't just about having a bronze ram. It was about crew coordination, tactical positioning, and the split-second decisions that determined whether you struck home or exposed your own flank to counterattack. Carthaginian vulnerability multiplied under the specific conditions of March 10th. The cargo weight prevented evasive maneuvers. Ships simply couldn't turn quickly enough to avoid Roman attacks. Formation cohesion broke down almost immediately, with individual ships unable to maintain coordinated positioning. Slow speed meant Carthaginian vessels couldn't achieve their own ramming velocity, turning what should have been mutual combat into one-sided predation. The undermanning of Marines meant even ships that survived initial ramming couldn't adequately defend their decks when Roman boarding parties arrived. Polybius would record the totals later: 50 Carthaginian ships sunk, 70 captured. But those numbers don't capture what the rams show, not just systematic destruction, but Roman administrative precision turned into weapons. Even in the chaos of naval warfare, quaestors certified rams, bureaucrats stamped bronze, and legal process governed killing. Roman crews trained all winter to row in perfect coordination, turned the narrow straits into a killing field where Carthaginian ships couldn't maneuver and couldn't escape. 35 bronze helmets scattered across the seabed, in clusters where ships went down. Each one a Montefortino type, the standard headgear of the Roman legionary by the mid-3 RD century BC. Spin-formed bronze bodies, conical domes designed to deflect sword blows, raised central knobs that once held decorative plumes, hinged cheek pieces, many still attached by their D-shaped bronze rings after 22 centuries underwater. Some helmets sit upright on the seafloor, as if waiting for owners who drowned too, 265 years ago. They tell the story Polybius couldn't. These weren't just naval crews. These were Roman Marines, legionaries, pulled from the Sicilian siege armies to serve as boarding parties. And they turned disabled Carthaginian ships into slaughterhouses. The Montefortino helmet type originated with Celtic tribes, specifically the Senones, whom Rome had fought in northern Italy. By 241 BC, Romans had adopted the design completely, valuing its durability and relative ease of mass production through spin-forming techniques. The conical shape provided structural strength. The flared rim protected the neck. The central knob, sometimes solid, sometimes hollow, served as attachment point for horsehair plumes that indicated rank or unit. Archaeological analysis confirms these helmets represent standard Roman military issue, not specialized naval equipment. Distribution patterns across the battle site are revealing helmets cluster in specific areas rather than scattering randomly. Each cluster likely marks where a specific ship sank, carrying its marine complement down into the deep water. The preservation of attachment rings and cheek pieces suggests many of these helmets were still being worn when the ships went down, not jettisoned during the fighting, but worn by soldiers who either couldn't escape the sinking vessels or chose to fight until the end. Roman ships carried full complements of Marines drawn from the legions besieging Carthaginian positions in Sicily. Polybius notes that the Roman fleet was fully manned, and historical analysis suggests these Marines were combat-experienced infantry, not hastily recruited sailors. They would have been equipped with standard, legionary gear, gladius short swords, pila javelins, if space permitted, shields, armor, and these bronze helmets. Their presence represented a significant Roman advantage, professional soldiers accustomed to close combat and coordinated fighting. Carthaginian marine deficit created catastrophic vulnerability. The Punic plan, remember, was sequential. Deliver supplies first, then embark Hamilcar's veterans to serve as Marines for the subsequent battle. This meant Carthaginian warships entering combat were undercomplemented with boarding defense troops. When Roman rams disabled Punic vessels, when Roman boarding parties swarmed across decks, the numerical imbalance in close combat became decisive. It wasn't just ship against ship. It was fully manned Roman boarding parties against undermanned Carthaginian defenders. The mechanics of ancient naval boarding combat were brutally straightforward. A ram strike would disable a ship hull below the waterline, taking on water, losing maneuverability. Before it sank completely, the attacking ship would draw alongside. Marines would leap or climb across, using grappling hooks to hold ships together. Close quarters fighting on confined deck space favored numbers, experience, and coordination, all areas where Romans held advantages. The objective was either to kill defenders and capture the ship as a prize, or to ensure it sank completely if capture wasn't feasible. Polybius records that Romans captured 70 Carthaginian ships along with their crews. The process of capturing 70 enemy vessels in a single engagement required systematic boarding operations across multiple hours of sustained combat. Marines would have been constantly engaged, one ship captured, then moving to the next target, then the next. The physical demands were extraordinary, fighting in armor, maintaining formation on unstable, blood-slicked decks, continuing to press attacks while wounded or exhausted. The 35 recovered helmets represent individual soldiers, many of whom died in this process. Anonymous now, their names lost. But their equipment survived to document their presence. One helmet among the 35 is different, badly corroded, of a different design from the standard Montefortino type. Archaeological analysis suggests it may be Carthaginian, or possibly from one of Carthage's Gallic mercenaries. If so, it confirms the multi-ethnic composition of Hanno's forces, recruited from across Carthage's trading empire and allied territories. This single different helmet among 34 Roman types hints at the lopsided combat, one non-Roman for every 34 Romans in the archaeological sample, though obviously this doesn't represent actual casualty ratios. The rams broke the ships. The Marines took the prizes. 70 Carthaginian vessels captured, an enormous haul, representing roughly 28% of Hanno's warship strength. Each captured ship meant dozens or hundreds of Carthaginian prisoners. The total, according to Polybius's explicit account, reached approximately 10,000 men captured. That's a staggering prisoner count, representing a significant portion of Carthage's available naval manpower. Hundreds of amphorae scattered across 3 square kilometers of seabed, not arranged in neat cargo holds, but strewn in patterns that speak of frantic action. Greek Italic wine jars, Punic oil containers, Maltese ovoidkrain amphorae. Some still sealed, others broken from impact, with the sea floor 130 meters below. The archaeological evidence is clear Carthaginian crews, realizing their cargo was killing them, began throwing everything overboard. Too late. Far too late. The Aegates Islands project has documented and cataloged hundreds of these amphorae through systematic survey work. Chemical analysis of the ceramic fabrics identifies manufacturing origins. The Greek Italic type, known as MGS5-6, came from wine-producing regions of southern Italy and Sicily. Ironic that Carthage was transporting Italian-made containers, but trade goods follow economic logic rather than war alliances. Punic types, including the distinctive Maltese ovoid form, were manufactured in Carthaginian-controlled territories. Some Greek-style jars bear Punic graffiti, evidence of a complex war economy where logistics officers used whatever containers were available, regardless of cultural origin. The original contents are identifiable through residue analysis and historical sources: wine and olive oil in amphorae designed for liquids, grain in wider-mouthed vessels, salted fish for protein during sieges. This was a complete supply package meant to sustain military operations for extended periods. The quantity was substantial. Each amphora, when full, weighed between 20 to 40 kilograms. Hundreds of amphorae per ship adds up to tons of additional weight, tons that reduced freeboard, making ships sit lower in the water, tons that raised the center of gravity, making ships more unstable. tons that increased turning radius and decreased acceleration, tons that turned warships into floating supply depots. The distribution pattern is what makes the archaeological evidence so revealing. If ships had sunk with organized cargo holds intact, amphorae would be found in concentrated clusters corresponding to ship layouts. Instead, they're scattered, jars found individually or in small groups across wide areas. The pattern archaeologists interpret as deliberate jettisoning, frantic attempts to lighten ships during combat. Picture the scene: Roman rams bearing down, Carthaginian crews suddenly understanding that their cargo is preventing evasive maneuvers. Desperate efforts to throw amphora after amphora overboard while simultaneously trying to defend against attack and maintain some semblance of tactical formation. But jettisoning cargo during combat is nearly impossible to execute systematically. It requires organized crew effort, passing amphorae up from holds, throwing them over sides. Doing this while under attack, while your ship is trying to maneuver, while panic spreads through inexperienced sailors who've never faced combat before. The scattered pattern suggests chaos rather than organized lightning operations. Some ships managed to dump some cargo. Most didn't manage enough. None managed it in time to restore combat effectiveness before Roman rams found their hulls. Standard naval doctrine, documented across Mediterranean warfare, was unambiguous: lighten ships before battle. Carthage should have done this at Hira before sailing. Take the time to offload cargo onto transports that would stay behind, or onto Hira's beaches, or anywhere that left warships in fighting trim. The decision to sail with cargo represents either overconfidence that combat wouldn't occur before reaching Sicily, or desperation about timeline that made proper preparation seem impossible. Either way, it was fatal. The transport vessels, somewhere between 150 to 350 ships. Sources disagree on precise numbers, presented their own problems. These were cargo ships without meaningful combat capability, no rams, minimal crews, vulnerable to any Roman vessel that got close. Their fate isn't detailed in Polybius's account, but the archaeological evidence suggests many were sunk or scattered. The amphora concentrations in some areas suggest transport ships going down with full cargoes, unable even to attempt flight. The weight that was supposed to save Hamilcar's army became the anchor that drowned Carthage's fleet. Each kilogram of grain represented another fraction of mobility lost. Each jar of wine was another moment of sluggishness when a ram approached. Physics doesn't care about strategic intent. Mass is mass. Weight is weight. And on March 10th, 241 basa, the mathematics of cargo burden proved as decisive as any tactical maneuver. Roman rams and Roman marines could sink and capture ships, but the real killer was logistics, the failure to separate supply delivery from naval combat, the assumption that you could accomplish both missions sequentially without the enemy interfering with your timeline. And as the morning wore on, as ships wallowed under cargo weight while Roman rams tore them open, Carthaginian formation dissolved completely. Individual captains, seeing disaster spreading across the fleet, began making independent decisions about survival, which meant the tightly controlled maneuver warfare that might have salvaged something from the tactical situation gave way to every ship for itself. Ancient sources rarely preserve the moment panic spreads through a fleet. Polybius uses a single word for what happened to the Carthaginians' rout. But the archaeological evidence ships scattered in multiple directions across the seabed. Amphorae, frantically jettisoned mid-battle, tells a more detailed story. Formation coherence shattered, one Carthaginian captain, seeing Roman rams bearing down and his own ship wallowing under cargo weight, turns his rudder west, away from Sicily, away from Hamilcar, away from the war. Then another captain sees the first ship fleeing and follows. Then 10 more. Then 50. Individual survival replaced coordinated tactics. And then the wind, which had favored Carthage that morning by filling their sails, saved what remained by suddenly shifting direction. Polybius explicitly describes this as a rout. That specific terminology carries weight. A rout isn't an organized withdrawal or a tactical retreat. It's the collapse of military cohesion when fear overwhelms discipline and individual soldiers or ships prioritize immediate survival over unit integrity. Archaeological distribution patterns suggest ships fled in multiple directions. The wreckage scatter shows no organized retreat path, just dispersal. The outcomes indicate panic spread through the Carthaginian fleet as losses mounted, and the impossibility of victory became obvious to every crew. The casualty toll by this point was catastrophic. 50 Carthaginian ships sunk. 20 of those went down with all hands. Polybius specifies this detail explicitly, meaning the crews, weighed down by armor and equipment, drowned in water, 70 to 130 meters deep, with no possibility of rescue. 30 more ships sank, but with some survivors who managed to stay afloat long enough for rescue. 70 ships captured, their crews taken prisoner. Total 120 ships, lost out of approximately 250 warships. That's a 48% loss rate. Historically, ancient naval battles rarely saw such lopsided outcomes. At Salamis in 480 BC, Persians lost approximately 200 ships out of 633%. At Ecnomus in 256 BC, earlier in this same war, Carthage lost 94 out of 350 ships, 27%. The Aegates casualty rate of 48% represents an exceptionally decisive defeat. These weren't marginal losses that could be absorbed. This was fleet destruction. Ships sinking with all hands deserve particular emphasis because of what it meant in practice. Ancient naval combat was brutal, but usually a significant percentage of crews survived even when their ships sank. They could abandon ship before it went under completely, cling to wreckage, be rescued by friendly vessels. But deep water changed that equation 70 to 130 meters down. There's no clinging to wreckage until you reach shallows. There's no wading to shore. You go into that water wearing armor and carrying weapons. You sink. The cold water would have contributed to hypothermia. Distance from shore meant even strong swimmers had no realistic chance. For the 20 ships that sank with all hands, we're talking about potentially 4 Ling 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 Dao Lao, 000 men, assuming 200 men per quinquereme, thousands, dead in minutes. The wind shift that Polybius documents saved the Carthaginian remnant from complete annihilation. The exact meteorological mechanism isn't specified in sources. Mediterranean weather patterns can shift rapidly with local thermal pain, effects, and wind pattern changes. But the tactical effect was decisive. The wind that had blown from the west during the morning, favoring Carthaginian sails on their approach, suddenly changed direction. Now fleeing Carthaginians could sail westward away from the disaster with wind assistance. Approximately 130 Carthaginian warships escaped. That's the mathematical remainder, after subtracting 120 losses from the original 250. These survivors fled with wind behind them, and Romans couldn't pursue. Remember the tactical decision Catulus and Falto had made: strip the ships, leave masts and sails on shore, maximize rowing speed for interception. That decision had worked perfectly for its intended purpose, but now it meant Roman ships optimized for rowing couldn't match the speed of Carthaginian ships sailing with favorable wind. The speed differential was roughly 3-1. Ships under sail in good wind conditions are simply much faster than rowing vessels. Romans could row after them, but catching sailing ships with rowing ships is effectively impossible unless you have hours of chase time and perfect conditions. The strategic decision was clear: accept that some enemies would escape rather than risk your own fleet in extended pursuit that probably wouldn't succeed anyway. Catulus and Falto had achieved their primary objective: interception and destruction of the relief mission. 120 ships destroyed or captured was more than sufficient to prevent any supplies reaching Sicily and to cripple Carthaginian naval capacity. Pursuing the remnant offered diminishing returns. The 130 ships that escaped returned to Carthage with news of disaster. They represented a broken force, not an operational fleet. They'd failed their mission completely. 0 supplies delivered, 0 troops embarked, and nearly half their warship strength destroyed in the attempt. Hamilcar remained isolated on Mount 10. Eryx. The starving garrisons remained starving. The First Punic War's outcome had been decided in approximately 4 hours of combat between dawn and mid-morning on March 10th. From the summit of Mount Eryx, on clear days, visibility extends 40-plus kilometers across the Mediterranean. Whether Hamilcar Barca personally observed the fleet's approach on March 10th, sources don't record, but from his elevated position at approximately 750 meters above sea level, the strategic situation would have been observable through fleet movements. Sails approaching from the west that morning. Then by afternoon, either disappearing westward or ceasing to move entirely. For 3 years, he'd kept 20,000 mercenaries alive and fighting through tactical brilliance. Now salvation or doom approached across water he couldn't cross, and there was nothing he could do except wait. News of the disaster reached Carthage within days. The surviving ships limping back to port carried the reports. Fleet intercepted before reaching Sicily. Catastrophic losses. Mission failed completely. The Carthaginian government's response is documented in Polybius's account. Strategic assessment: no capacity to man or fund another relief fleet. The losses: 120 ships. Sure, 000 prisoners. Plus, the failed mission's logistical costs were simply too severe. Carthage couldn't replace that much naval strength, or those crews quickly enough to matter. The Senate recognized reality and ordered Hamilcar to negotiate peace terms. Here's where Hamilcar's character shows through in sources he was ordered to negotiate. He refused to personally handle surrender. According to Polybius, Hamilcar delegated the responsibility to Gisco, the commander of the Lilybaeum garrison. Historians have interpreted this refusal in various ways. Perhaps it was personal honor. He'd held Mount Eryx for 3 years. never been defeated in battle, and wouldn't personally give Romans the satisfaction of his surrender. Perhaps it was political calculation. He knew he'd need credibility for future roles, and avoiding direct association with surrender preserved that. Perhaps it was simply that Gisco, commanding a garrison position rather than field army, was the more appropriate negotiator for a territorial surrender. Whatever Hamilcar's motivations, the decision had consequences. He preserved his personal reputation even in defeat. Later sources note that Hamilcar wasn't blamed for the war's outcome. He'd done everything possible with the resources provided. That reputation preservation mattered. Hamilcar would return to Carthage, suppress the mercenary war that followed, and then embark on the Spanish campaign that rebuilt Carthaginian power. His sons would inherit that restored capability and use it against Rome in the Second Punic War. Hamilcar's refusal to personally surrender on March 10th, 241 BC was part of a longer strategic arc that would stretch across decades. Gisco sailed to meet the Romans. The Treaty of Lutatius, named after the consul who'd won the war, was written in blood and silver. 200 talents, approximately 82,000 kilograms of silver. 000 talents paid immediately actually increased to 200 by the Roman Senate when they ratified the treaty. The rest over 10 years. Carthage would evacuate Sicily completely. Every soldier, every garrison, every foothold accumulated over 23 years. The Aegates Islands, where the battle was fought, ceded to Rome. The Lipari Islands ceded to Rome. Sicily itself would become Rome's first overseas province. The terms weren't just harsh, they were designed to humiliate. The negotiation process was brief, because Carthage had no leverage. Gisco represented Carthage, not Hamilcar, who'd refused the task. Catullus represented Rome, though he'd been injured and hadn't personally commanded the battle. The location was probably Sicily, though sources don't specify precisely. Speed was driven by Carthaginian desperation. They needed peace before the situation deteriorated further, before Rome decided to invade Africa, before the mercenary armies waiting for payment became uncontrollable. The financial terms deserve emphasis because they shaped everything that followed. 200 talents of silver was an enormous sum, approximately 82,000 kilograms, using standard ancient weight conversions. To visualize, that's about 82 modern cars worth of silver by weight. The payment schedule originally negotiated was 1,000 talents immediately. Then SWI, 200, over 20 years, 110 talents per year. But when the treaty reached Rome for Senate ratification, the senators made it harsher. They increased the immediate payment to 200 talents, and shortened the payment period to 10 years, 220 talents annually. The modification reflected Roman determination to maximize Carthage's economic pain and accelerate the return on investment for the private citizens who'd funded the fleet. The purpose was explicit: repay the private investors, extract war reparations, and cripple Carthage economically so they couldn't quickly rebuild naval power. The arithmetic worked for Rome. The 3,200 talent indemnity covered the fleet construction costs with surplus for other war expenses. Rome's wealthy elite, who'd gambled their personal fortunes on victory, got repaid with effectively no financial loss. The unprecedented venture capital model had succeeded completely. Territorial concessions were equally significant. Sicily, The entire island, except the small portion Rome already controlled, became Roman territory. More importantly, it became Rome's first provincia, an overseas possession administered by a governor sent from Rome rather than an allied territory. This was unprecedented in Roman history. Rome had conquered Italy through a system of alliances and treaties that left local governance largely intact. Sicily represented something new: direct Roman administration of foreign territory. The template it established would shape Roman imperialism for centuries. Spain, Africa, Greece, Asia would all follow the Sicilian model. The Aegates Islands and Lipari Islands also passed to Roman control, giving Rome strategic naval bases controlling the approaches to Sicily and southern Italy. Carthage was forbidden from attacking Rome's allies, which meant most of the central Mediterranean was effectively closed to Carthaginian military operations. The Roman Senate's modifications when they ratified the treaty showed how little sympathy existed for Carthage's position. The original agreement, negotiated by Catullus and Gisco, was already harsh. The Senate made it harsher. Historical sources don't document significant debate about the modifications. Apparently, Senate consensus supported maximum pressure. Carthage had no choice but to accept. The alternative was continued warfare, when Carthage had just demonstrated they couldn't field an effective fleet. But perhaps most importantly, the treaty sowed seeds of the next war. The humiliation burned into Carthaginian consciousness. The economic burden was crushing. The territorial losses were permanent, and the manner of the defeat caught unprepared. Fleet destroyed, forced to accept terms with no room for negotiation, created deep resentment in Carthage, particularly in the Barcid family. Hamilcar had refused to personally surrender. That refusal preserved his honor, but it also preserved his anger. He would transmit that anger to his sons. One of them, a 9-year-old boy in 241 BC, would grow up remembering Carthage's humiliation. 23 years later, that boy, Hannibal, would cross the Alps seeking revenge. The First Punic War ended on March 10th, 241 BC. Carthage's suffering had just begun. Archer, 000 mercenaries returned to North Africa from Sicily, unpaid, angry, expecting wages from a treasury that was bankrupt. When Carthage couldn't pay, they revolted. Unlike Rome's citizen legions who served for honor and land, these were professionals who'd come for money. They had no reason to stop short of Carthage's destruction. What followed was 4 years of the most brutal warfare recorded in antiquity, conflict that nearly ended Carthage as a civilization. The mercenary crisis was direct consequence of Aegates' economics. Polybius dedicates significant space to describing what he calls the mercenary war, or the truceless war. Truceless, because both sides fought with such savagery that normal conventions of warfare were abandoned. The composition of the mercenary army reflected Carthage's empire Libyans, Spanish, Gauls, Greeks, Balearic Islanders 000 plus soldiers who'd served in Sicily for years fighting Rome, now returning home expecting payment. The 200 talent indemnity to Rome, plus war costs, had left Carthaginian treasury completely empty. The government couldn't pay. The soldiers wouldn't accept that. Revolt was inevitable. The scope of the crisis exceeded any normal military mutiny. The revolt spread across Libya and North African territories. Local populations, resentful of Carthaginian control and taxation, joined the mercenaries. At one point, Carthage itself was besieged, the capital city surrounded by armies it had formerly commanded. The population suffered starvation. Historical sources describe exceptional brutality on both sides. Prisoners weren't ransomed according to normal practice. They were tortured and killed. The conflict took on characteristics of ethnic war, with Libyans attempting to completely destroy Carthaginian power in North Africa. Hamilcar Barca led the suppression campaign. His tactics were ruthless but effective. He trapped mercenary armies, cut supply lines, and showed no mercy to rebels. The campaign required multiple years, 241 to 237 BC, of sustained operations. Hamilcar succeeded where other Carthaginian commanders failed, saving the city and reconquering Libya. But the cost was enormous. Casualty figures for the mercenary war aren't precisely documented, but Polybius's account makes clear that tens of thousands died on both sides. The conflict nearly destroyed Carthage from within. The personal impact on Hamilcar was profound. He'd held Mount Eryx for 3 years, never been defeated in battle, then been forced to negotiate peace because Carthage's fleet failed at Aegates. Now, he was fighting to prevent complete Carthaginian collapse caused by that same defeat's economic consequences. Historical sources document that Hamilcar's hatred of Rome intensified during this period. The Barcid family blamed Rome for creating the crisis. The crushing indemnity had made it impossible to pay the mercenaries, and Rome's vindictive treaty terms had weakened Carthage enough that rebellion became possible. While Carthage fought for survival, Rome committed what sources describe as cynical opportunism. In 238 BC, while Carthaginian forces were still fighting the mercenary revolt, Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica. The justification was questionable. Rome claimed Carthaginian vessels had attacked Roman merchants, but the reality was transparent exploitation of Carthaginian weakness. Carthage was in no position to resist. The islands fell to Rome without significant fighting. Then Rome imposed an additional indemnity, 200 talents of silver. The total burden rose from 200 to 400 talents, approximately 112, 500 kilograms of silver total. The compounding humiliation was systematic. First, defeat at Aegates and loss of Sicily. Second, crushing indemnity that bankrupted the treasury. Third, mercenary war, triggered by inability to pay soldiers. Fourth, while fighting for survival, loss of Sardinia and Corsica. Fifth, additional indemnity for islands taken while Carthage was helpless. Each humiliation built on the previous one. The Barcid family, having saved Carthage from the mercenary revolt, would not forget or forgive. Hamilcar's response shaped the next 2 decades of Mediterranean history. He concluded that Rome must be punished, but Carthage needed to rebuild economic and military capability first. The target Spain, the Iberian Peninsula offered silver mines, military recruitment opportunities, and strategic position outside Roman interference. In 237 BC, Hamilcar took his army to Spain. He brought his sons, including 9-year-old Hannibal. According to Livy's detailed account, before leaving Carthage, Hamilcar made Hannibal place his hand on a sacrificial altar and swear eternal hatred of Rome. The Spanish campaign was systematic. Hamilcar conquered Spanish tribes, established Carthaginian control over southeastern Iberia, and exploited the silver mines. The well-funded military rebuilding. Spanish tribes became Carthaginian allies, providing excellent infantry and cavalry. For 16 years, 237 to 221 BC, the Barcid family built an empire in Spain. Hamilcar died in battle in 228 BC. His son-in-law Hasdrubal continued the work, and in 221 BC, at Aegates, Hannibal Barca inherited command of the Spanish army. 3 years later, he would cross the Alps with elephants. The Battle of the Aegates Islands was over, but its consequences were accelerating toward collision. Before March 10th, 241 BC, Rome controlled Italy, a land power with no naval tradition, no overseas territories, no empire. After March 10th, 241 BC, Rome controlled Sicily, a Mediterranean naval power with its first overseas province and a template for conquest that would follow. The Battle of the Aegates Islands didn't just end a war, it invented the Roman Empire. Sicily's status as Rome's first provincia represented an administrative innovation with massive implications. Previously, Roman expansion in Italy had worked through alliance systems. Cities and tribes that surrendered or allied with Rome kept their internal governance, provided troops when requested, and accepted Roman foreign policy direction. This system worked for Italian peoples who shared cultural similarities. But Sicily was different, culturally Greek and Phoenician, economically developed, geographically separate from Italy. Direct administration by a Roman governor became necessary. The provincial system Rome created for Sicily became the template for everything that followed. A governor, usually a former consul or praetor, served a fixed term administering the territory. Local tax collection funded provincial administration and provided revenue for Rome. Roman law applied to disputes involving Roman citizens. Local legal systems handled internal matters for native populations. Military garrisons maintained order. The framework was flexible enough to accommodate different territories while maintaining Roman control. Spain, Africa, Greece, Asia, each became a provincia, following variations of the Sicilian model. Economic benefits flowed immediately from Sicily's grain production. The island's agricultural capacity had made it valuable enough to fight over for 23 years. As a Roman province, Sicily's grain tribute fed Rome's growing population. The economic cycle became self-reinforcing. Provincial revenues funded further military operations. Conquests added more provinces. More provinces generated more resources. War started paying for itself through the tribute system. The venture capital model that funded the 242 BC fleet proved that private wealth could finance military operations when state resources were insufficient. That precedent would be used again. Roman naval supremacy, established at Aegates, lasted for centuries. Before the First Punic War, Rome had no naval tradition whatsoever. The first Roman fleet was built in 260 BC, using a captured Carthaginian ship as template. 20 years later, after catastrophic losses and brutal learning experiences, Rome had defeated the Mediterranean's premier naval power. Carthage's fleet, the 130 ships escaped from Aegates, never recovered its former dominance. The destruction of crew expertise, the financial burden of rebuilding, and the political impact of total failure meant Carthaginian naval power remained permanently diminished. Rome controlled the central Mediterranean sea lanes. Roman merchants operated with security. Future Roman campaigns could move troops and supplies by sea without serious challenge. The psychological transformation may have been most significant. Rome had feared naval warfare after drowning 100,000 men in storms during the 250s BC. The Senate had temporarily abandoned maritime operations entirely. But Aegates proved Romans could defeat a premier sea power through systematic preparation and tactical innovation. The psychological barrier to overseas campaigns dissolved. Within a century, Rome would dominate the entire Mediterranean basin. Greece would fall. Macedonia would fall. The Seleucid Empire would be humbled. Egypt would become a client state. The sequence wasn't inevitable. Historical contingency always matters. But Aegates removed the mental constraints that might have kept Rome as merely an Italian power. The Latin phrase mare nostrum our sea would later capture Roman attitude toward the Mediterranean. The concept dated from this transformation. The sea wasn't an obstacle or a foreign environment. It was Roman space, a highway rather than a barrier. That conceptual shift enabled the aggressive expansion that defined the next 2 centuries of Roman history. The timeline of conquest Sicily in 241 BC, Sardinia and Corsica in 238 BC, Spain by 218 BC when the Second Punic War began, Africa by 146 BC when Carthage was finally destroyed, Greece through the mid-2nd century BC. The sequence shows Rome's systematic expansion from Italian hegemon to Mediterranean superpower, the political alignment of financial and strategic interests, created by the private financing model, had lasting implications. Rome's elite now had direct financial incentives for military expansion. Successful wars brought indemnities that repaid investments. Conquered territories became provinces that generated tax revenue and economic opportunities for Roman merchants and administrators. The link between personal enrichment and imperial expansion reinforced itself across generations. The men who'd loaned money for the 242 fleet weren't just repaid. They saw the model work and replicated it in future crises. Strategic vision, whether deliberate or emergent from opportunistic decisions, pulled Rome toward Mediterranean dominance. Each successful campaign made the next one more feasible. Each province provided resources for further expansion. Compound effects of conquest accelerated over time. Sicily provided grain. Spain provided silver. Africa and Greece provided wealth and trained troops. By 310 BC, when Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra at Actium, the Mediterranean was completely unified under Roman control. 500-plus years of Roman Mediterranean dominance traced directly back to March 10th, 241 BC, when private loans and stripped ships won a battle that transformed a city-state into an empire. 218 BC, 77 years after Aegates, Hannibal Barca crossed the Alps with 37 elephants and 50,000 troops. Polybius and Livy both trace this invasion's origins to the First Punic War's conclusion, specifically to the humiliation at Aegates and the seizure of Sardinia. According to Livy's detailed account, in Devasto 37 BC, A 9-year-old boy named Hannibal placed his hand on an altar in Carthage and swore eternal hatred of Rome. His father, Hamilcar, who'd refused to personally surrender after the Aegates Islands, made him swear. Ancient historians disagree on many details of the Punic Wars, but on this they converge. The Second Punic War was the First Punic War continued, revenge, for 241 BC. The oath ceremony is documented in Livy's narrative with specific details. Hamilcar was preparing to depart for Spain. He was conducting sacrifices before departure, a standard religious practice. Young Hannibal asked to come with him to Spain. Hamilcar agreed, but first made him approach the altar and place his hand on the sacrifice. The oath: swear eternal hatred of Rome. Never be a friend of Romans. Livy presents this as memory from Hannibal himself, recounted later when Hannibal sought alliance with Antiochus of Syria against Rome. The story may be embellished. Childhood oaths make dramatic narrative. But Polybius confirms Hannibal's deep hatred of Rome was established early and driven by family experience. The Spanish campaign, 237 to 221 BC, was explicitly preparation for renewed war against Rome. Hamilcar conquered Spanish tribes systematically, built Carthaginian power in Iberia, and exploited the peninsula's rich silver mines. The wealth from Spanish mining operations funded military rebuilding. Spanish tribes became Carthaginian allies, providing excellent infantry, particularly the famously fierce Celtiberian warriors and cavalry. Hamilcar died in battle in 228 BC, but the work continued. His son-in-law Hasdrubal governed from 228 to 221 BC. Then Hannibal, at age 26, inherited command of a Spanish army and empire built specifically to challenge Rome. Polybius dedicates significant analysis to Second Punic War causation, Book 3, chapters 9 to 15. His conclusion emphasizes Carthaginian resentment from the First War settlement. Primary grievances documented the Aegates indemnity of 3,200 talents, the opportunistic seizure of Sardinia and Corsica in 238 BC with additional 1,200 talent penalty, and the accumulated humiliation of being defeated and then exploited when helpless. The Barcid family was identified by both Polybius and Livy as the driving force for revenge. Hannibal's personal motivation derived directly from childhood experiences of Carthage's defeat and his father's transmitted hatred. The Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BC, nearly destroyed Rome. Hannibal crossed the Alps in an audacious strategic maneuver, invaded Italy, and won battle after battle. Trebia, in 218 BC. Lake Trasimena, in Coxisata Seitsemantoista BC. Cannae, in 216 BC, the worst single-day defeat in Roman military history, with 50 Ling-Ling-Ling.000 Romans killed in one afternoon. That's more Roman dead at Cannae than in all naval battles of the First Punic War combined. For 15 years, Hannibal operated in Italy, undefeated in major engagements, threatening Rome itself. But Hannibal couldn't take Rome. The city's fortifications were too strong. His siege capability insufficient. Rome's alliance system in Italy, though strained, largely held, and Rome adapted strategically, avoiding direct battle with Hannibal while attacking Carthaginian positions elsewhere. Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Africanus, invaded Africa, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal. At Zama Inikiuziki Bese, Scipio defeated Hannibal in Africa. The war ended in 201 BC, with terms even harsher than 241 BC. Carthage survived as a city, but ceased to be a great power. The irony was perfect. The Battle of the Aegates Islands won Rome the First Punic War. But the harsh terms created such resentment that they cost Rome hundreds of thousands of lives in the second. Hamilcar's refusal to personally surrender after Aegates preserved his honor. His son Hannibal used that honor to invade Italy and nearly destroy the Roman Republic. The 27 bronze rams recovered from the Mediterranean seabed tell the story of one battle. But the consequences of that battle rippled for 95 years, until Carthage itself was wiped from the map in 146 BC. Sometimes the cost of victory is paid in the next war. For 265 years, the Battle of the Aegates Islands was nearly forgotten. Historians knew it happened. Polybius recorded it. Livy mentioned it. But no battlefield, no physical evidence, no way to verify ancient accounts. The Second Punic War, with Hannibal's legendary Alpine crossing and the slaughter at Cannae, overshadowed the battle that had caused it. Then, in 2005, a fisherman off the coast of Sicily pulled up something bronze and impossibly heavy, a warship ram, 270 kilograms of ancient weapons technology. The seabed began revealing its secrets. The first ram, later catalogued as Aegates I, was found by accident. Fishermen working off the Aegates Islands snagged their nets on something massive on the sea floor. When they hauled it up, they discovered a bronze rostrum in remarkable preservation. The discovery reached Dr. Plain, Sebastiano Tusa, Sicily's superintendent of the Sea for Cultural Heritage. He recognized immediately what it meant: physical evidence of the Aegates Islands battle, preserved in cold, deep water for over 2 millennia. In 2008, systematic archaeological survey work began. The Aegates Islands Archaeological Project was collaborative between the RPM Nautical Foundation, an American organization specializing in nautical archaeology, and Sicily's Soprintendenza del Mare. The methodology combined cutting-edge technology with traditional archaeological rigor. ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, equipped with high-resolution cameras and side-scan sonar, mapped the seabed systematically. GPS coordinates were recorded with sub-meter accuracy for every artifact location. Technical divers recovered artifacts when conditions permitted, though the 70 to 130 meter depths made this challenging and dangerous work. From 2008 through 2019, the project recovered 26 more rams, total 27 bronze rostra, each one representing a warship that fought and died on March 10th. 241 BC. The rams varied slightly in design, suggesting different workshops or construction periods. 7 bore Latin inscriptions with quaestors' names and probatios certifications. 1 bore a Punic inscription with prayers to Carthaginian gods. The epigraphic evidence alone revolutionized understanding of Roman administrative practices and Carthaginian religious culture during the war. Beyond rams, the project found 35 bronze helmets, predominantly Montefortino type, hundreds of amphorae, documented through survey work, too many to recover completely, but enough to map distribution patterns. The amphora types confirmed Polybius's description of a supply mission. The scatter pattern suggested frantic jettisoning during combat ship fittings. Weapons, fragments. and other military equipment emerged from the seabed. Each artifact added detail to the picture of what happened on that March morning. The archaeological validation of Polybius is historically significant. For centuries, scholars had only textual sources. See Polybius's detailed account, Livy's briefer summary, fragmentary references in other ancient authors. Some details seemed suspiciously precise. Were the casualty figures accurate or exaggerated? Did events really unfold as described? The physical evidence settles these questions. The rams prove violent ship-to-ship combat occurred. The amphorae prove the Carthaginian cargo burden. The helmets prove Roman marines were present. The distribution of artifacts across the seabed between Levanzo and Favignana confirms the battle location. Science validates history in a rare convergence of archaeological and textual evidence. Why was Aegates forgotten for so long? The Second Punic War was simply more dramatic. Hannibal, crossing the Alps, with elephants captured imaginations. Cannae, where 50,000 plus Romans died in one day, became the most studied battle in military history. Scipio Africanus defeating Hannibal at Zama provided a dramatic conclusion. The First Punic War seemed like prologue, and Aegates seemed like just another naval battle in a war full of them. Roman monuments commemorated land victories. Naval battles fought away from audiences, and leaving no visible battlefield didn't generate the same cultural memory. Historians recognized Aegates' importance. It ended the longest ancient war. It created Rome's first province. Military scholars studied it as an example of how crew training and tactical preparation can overcome numerical disadvantage. But without physical evidence, it remained an abstraction. The archaeological discoveries changed that. Now you can visit the Museo Archeologico Regionale Lilibeo in Marsala, Sicily, and see actual rams from the battle. You can examine the Latin inscriptions, see the impact damage, understand the violence in a tangible way, impossible from reading Polybius alone. The human scale matters. 35 helmets mean 35 individual soldiers. We don't know their names. Sources don't preserve individual stories, but their equipment survived. Each helmet represents a person who fought on March 10th, 241 BC, who either died in the battle or survived it, whose actions contributed infinitesimally to the outcome that changed Mediterranean history. The anonymity doesn't diminish the humanity, it emphasizes it. These weren't legendary heroes whose deeds were recorded for posterity. These were common soldiers whose collective actions decided the war. Tourism to the Aegates Islands has grown as word of the archaeological discoveries spread. Ferries run regularly from Trapani on Sicily's western coast to Favignana, Levanzo, and Marettimo. You can stand on Favignana's shore and look west across the waters where 600 ships clashed. You can visit Marsala's museum and see rams, helmets, amphorae, equipment from men who died too, 265 years ago, preserved by cold, deep water, and recovered by 21st century technology. The battlefield itself remains protected. Diving to artifact sites is prohibited, preserving the underwater heritage for future archaeological work. The Battle of the Aegates Islands was fought for control of Sicily's grain fields. It ended the longest war in ancient history. It created the Roman Empire. It caused the Second Punic War. And it's been sitting on the Mediterranean seabed all along, waiting for technology to advance enough to recover its story. This is what makes the Battle of the Aegates Islands extraordinary. Not just that Rome won, but how Rome won bankrupt treasury, create venture capital through private loans. No trained crews. Drill them daily all winter. Adverse weather making interception impossible. Strip your ships and row anyway. Outnumbered. Doesn't matter if enemy ships carry the weight of their own defeat. The Romans at Aegates didn't overcome impossible odds through luck or divine intervention. They engineered solutions to every problem. Private financing solved bankruptcy. Training solved inexperience. Stripped ships solved weather disadvantage. And Carthaginian strategic negligence sailing cargo-laden ships into battle did the rest. But victory's price was paid in lives. 50 Carthaginian ships sank in water, 70 to 130 meters deep. 20 went down with all hands, hundreds of men per ship, weighed down by armor, drowning in Mediterranean cold. 70 more ships captured. Sure, 000 prisoners taken. 30 Roman ships sank, carrying perhaps 6,000 men to their deaths. The 35 bronze helmets recovered from the seabed represent 35 soldiers whose names we'll never know, but whose equipment survived to tell their story. The 27 bronze rams, each one a ship, each ship a crew, each crew dozens or hundreds of men, sit in museums as monuments to the day that changed history. March 10th, 241 BC, the First Punic War ends. Rome gets Sicily, its first province. The template for empire is set. But Carthage gets humiliation Troas, 200 talents of silver, evacuation of Sicily after 23 years of war. Then in 238 BC, Rome seizes Sardinia while Carthage fights the mercenary war, adding 200 more talents to the insult. A 9-year-old boy named Hannibal places his hand on an altar and swears eternal hatred. 20 years later, he crosses the Alps seeking revenge. At Cannae, he kills 50. Lean, thou cheeser. 000 Romans in a single afternoon. More than died in all naval battles of the First Punic War combined. The Second Punic War nearly destroys Rome. The victory at Aegates guaranteed the war that almost ended the Republic. For 265 years. This story existed only in ancient texts. Polybius recorded it. Historians studied it. But no one could touch it. Then the seabed gave up its secrets: 27 rams, 35 helmets, hundreds of amphorae. Physical proof that Polybius got it right. The distribution of artifacts maps the battle. The damage patterns on the rams show the violence of the collisions. The scatter pattern of amphorae reveals Carthaginian desperation to jettison cargo mid-battle. History and archaeology converged in the waters between 3 small Sicilian islands. Here's what the Battle of the Aegates Islands teaches us. First, preparation defeats numbers. 4 months of winter training beats centuries of Carthaginian naval tradition. Second, logistics wins wars. The Romans understood this. Strip your ships. Maximize speed. The Carthaginians forgot this. Cargo-laden warships can't maneuver. Third, victory without magnanimity creates future enemies. The harsh terms at Aegates, the indemnities, the territorial losses. The humiliation didn't prevent another war. They guaranteed it. Fourth, sometimes the battles that change history aren't the famous ones everyone knows. Cannae. Military historians study Zama. But Aegates, the battle that created Rome's empire and set Hannibal on his path, remained nearly forgotten until 21st century archaeology resurrected it. If you visit Sicily today, you can take a ferry to the Aegates Islands, stand on Favignana's shore, and look west across the waters where 600 ships clashed. Visit the museum in Marsala and see the bronze rams, the helmets, the amphorae, equipment from men who died 265 years ago, preserved by cold, deep water, and recovered by technology. The Battle of the Aegates Islands was fought for control of Sicily's grain fields. It ended the longest war in ancient history. It created the Roman Empire. It caused the Second Punic War. And it's been sitting on the Mediterranean seabed all along, waiting for us to remember. March 10th, 241 BC, Rome was bankrupt. The treasury empty after 23 years of war. So Rome's wealthiest citizens did something unprecedented. They loaned their personal fortunes, 200 warships, funded by private citizens, repayable only if Rome won the war. It was venture capital applied to warfare, the ancient world's most audacious financial gamble. And in the waters between 3 small islands, that gamble either saved the Republic or destroyed Rome's richest families. 200 Roman ships faced 600 Carthaginian vessels, warships, plus transports loaded with food, wine, weapons for Hamilcar Barca's starving army. But Carthage made a fatal error, sailed cargo-laden warships into battle. The Romans, 4 months of daily winter drilling, stripped ships, rowing at combat speed directly into gale force winds, an achievement Carthaginians thought physically impossible. The result, 50 Carthaginian ships sunk, 70 captured. Sure, 000 prisoners, all in about 4 hours of brutal ramming warfare. 27 bronze rams recovered from the seabed, 270 kilograms each. Latin inscriptions with questor certifications, proof that Roman bureaucracy governed even weapons manufacturing. 35 bronze helmets, anonymous soldiers whose names died but whose equipment survived. 265 years underwater. Hundreds of amphorae frantically jettisoned mid-battle, too late to save ships wallowing under cargo weight. The private investors got repaid. Sicily became Rome's first province, the template for empire. But the harsh treaty terms 200 talents, silver, territorial humiliation, opportunistic seizure of Sardinia created such Carthaginian resentment that a 9-year-old boy named Hannibal swore eternal hatred of Rome. 23 years later, he crossed the Alps with elephants seeking revenge. If this story changed how you think about venture capital warfare, about winter training defeating numerical superiority, about cargo logistics as battlefield weapon, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment. What shocked you most? That wealthy Romans loaned personal fortunes, that crews drilled daily all winter, that Carthaginians sailed, loaded warships into battle, that Romans rode into gale force winds, that 27 bronze rams sat underwater for 265 years. Share this with someone who needs to understand that the most important battles are often the forgotten ones because they were too complex to celebrate, too administrative to romanticize, too uncomfortable to teach. Because that's the eternal lesson of Aegates 241 BC. Rome was bankrupt. Private citizens gambled personal fortunes. 4 months of winter drilling. Stripped ships rowing into gales. Bronze rams certified by bureaucrats. Cargo-laden Carthaginians who couldn't maneuver. 4 hours of combat. 120 Carthaginian ships destroyed. Sand, 200 talents, silver. Sicily becomes first province. The venture capital navy saved Rome and invented the empire. But the harsh victory sowed seeds of revenge, 9-year-old Hannibal swearing eternal hatred. 23 years later, Alps crossed. Elephants deployed. Canes piengiscent. Cree, ling ling ling, Bautzeischer. 000, Roman dead. More than all First Punic War naval battles combined. The Second Punic War nearly destroyed Rome, all because Aegates' victory was too total, too humiliating, too expensive. For 265 years, this sat underwater. 2005, fisherman finds first ram. 2008 to 2019, 27 rams. 35 helmets. Hundreds of amphorae recovered. Polybius validated. History confirmed. The seabed spoke. Sometimes the battles that change history are the ones nobody remembers until the Mediterranean gives up its secrets. The Battle of the Aegates Islands, where venture capital met winter training, where bronze rams, certified by bureaucrats, ended the longest ancient war, where cargo logistics became death sentence, where Rome's richest families bet everything on victory. They won. They got repaid. Sicily became Provincia. The empire was born. And 265 years later, we finally have the proof.